The air inside the abandoned wing of Blackwood Asylum was thick with the suffocating scent of pulverized brick and decades of undisturbed rot. Leonor crouched in the suffocating darkness, her face and mourning dress coated in a fine layer of gray dust. In her trembling hands, she clutched a brittle, yellowed medical ledger, its pages illuminated only by the dying, anemic flicker of a single oil lamp she had shielded beneath a rusted iron bucket. Her hands were not shaking from the ghost stories the townsfolk whispered about this cursed place. They were shaking with a volcanic, righteous fury. Through the heavy, rotting floorboards above, the distinct rhythmic thud of heavy leather boots echoed down the stone corridor. One pair, then two. The men had come to silence her in the dark, just as they had silenced her husband. They thought she was just a broken, hysterical widow hiding in a madhouse. They had no idea what she had found in the walls. As the footsteps draw closer to her hiding place, and before we witness the explosive reckoning that is about to unfold, take a moment to tell us in the comments what city you're watching from today. Make sure to leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story of ordinary people bringing down corrupt empires. Now, let us step back into the light, to the day this nightmare began, to understand how a woman of quiet dignity was cast into the abyss, only to forge herself into a weapon of absolute justice. It was an unseasonably cold autumn morning when they buried Arthur. The wind howling through the cemetery felt like a physical blow against Leonor's fragile frame. She stood alone by the freshly turned earth, clutching a rosary until her knuckles turned white. Arthur was a good man, a meticulous accountant who had started asking the wrong questions about the sudden transfer of Prime Valley farmland to the city council. A week later, he was found dead in his study, the local physician hastily ruling it a sudden and tragic heart failure. Leonor knew her husband's heart. It was strong, steady, and entirely unbroken until the moment he crossed the mare. She had barely returned to her empty, quiet home, the scent of Arthur's pipe tobacco still lingering in the curtains, when the heavy, ominous knock rattled the front door. Mayor Silas Thorne did not bother to remove his expensive, silk-lined bowler hat when he stepped into her parlor. He was a man composed entirely of calculated cruelty, wrapped in tailored wool and smelling of expensive imported cigars and peppermint. Behind him stood the town sheriff, a large, silent man whose badge was firmly in the mayor's deep pockets. Thorne did not offer condolences. He offered a stack of heavily stamped legal documents. With a smile that failed to reach his dead, predatory eyes, Thorne explained that Arthur had been keeping secrets. According to the papers Thorne slapped onto her polished dining table, Arthur had accrued catastrophic debts, gambling away their home, their savings, and their future, all owed to the city bank, which Thorne conveniently owned. Leonor stared at the forged signatures, the ink practically fresh. She knew it was a lie. Arthur despised gambling. But the county judge was Thorne's brother-in-law. The sheriff was his lapdog. The town was his kingdom. When Leonor softly but firmly called him a liar, Thorne's smile widened into a grimace of pure malice. He leaned over the table, invading her space, his voice dripping with venomous pity. He told her she was clearly hysterical with grief. He told her she was a poor, confused woman whose mind was fracturing under the weight of her husband's sins. And then he delivered the final, crushing blow. He informed her that the bank was seizing the house by nightfall. The only property left to her name, a cruel joke of a deed transferred to Arthur years ago as a worthless settlement, was the Blackwood Asylum. It was a sprawling, Gothic monstrosity of black stone perched on the jagged cliffs at the edge of the county, abandoned 30 years prior after rumors of horrific abuses forced its closure. Thorne told her to pack a single bag. He mocked her, suggesting the mountain air and the quiet isolation of the madhouse would be the perfect cure for her delicate, grieving nerves. The walk to the edge of town was an agonizing procession of humiliation. Leonor carried a single battered leather valise and the heavy Winchester rifle her husband kept for hunting. The townsfolk, people she had baked pies for, people she had sat next to in church, closed their shutters and turned their faces to the dirt. Fear of Thorn was a poison that had paralyzed the entire valley. They watched the widow march toward her exile, convinced she would either die of exposure within a week or lose whatever remained of her sanity in the cursed halls of Blackwood. The sun was bleeding a deep, bruised purple across the horizon when the iron gates of Blackwood Asylum loomed out of the encroaching fog. It was an architecture born of nightmares. High, jagged spires pierced the sky like broken teeth. The windows were either shattered or barred with heavy, rusted iron grates. The wind whipped through the empty corridors, creating a low, mournful wail that sounded terrifyingly human. As Leonor pushed the heavy front doors open, the hinges screamed in protest. Inside, the darkness was absolute, heavy, and smelling of damp earth, rat droppings, and decades of forgotten despair. Overturned iron cots littered the main hall. Leather restraint straps lay rotting on the floor like dead snakes. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to flee into the woods, to surrender to the freezing night rather than spend a single second in this tomb. The psychological weight of the place was designed to break the human spirit. She felt the terrifying, creeping sensation that Thorn was right, that the isolation and the ghosts of this place would slowly peel away her sanity until she became just another phantom echoing in the dark. But as she stood shivering in the grand foyer, the heavy Winchester biting into her shoulder, a different emotion began to take root beneath the terror. It was indignation. It was a hot, bright spark of pure rage. Thorn wanted her to break. He wanted her to crawl into a corner of this horrific place and die quietly, a convenient loose end tied up and buried. She refused to give him the satisfaction. Leonor tightened her grip on her bag. She was not a victim, and she was not mad. Survival required absolute, methodical focus. She spent the first 3 days fighting the environment. She claimed the old director's office on the ground floor, the only room with an intact fireplace and a heavy oak door that still possessed a working brass lock. She stripped the room of its rotting carpets, scrubbing the stone floor with water she drew from a terrifyingly deep, echoing well in the central courtyard. She found a cache of dry firewood left behind in the old kitchens, along with an old, rusted cast-iron pot. When she finally managed to strike a match and coax a fire into life in the director's fireplace, the flickering orange glow pushed back the oppressive shadows. She boiled water, made a meager soup from the dried provisions she had packed, and sat before the flames, the rifle resting across her knees. The asylum was not a haunted house. It was just cold stone and dead wood. The only monsters in this world were men like Silas Thorn. It was on the 5th day that the asylum revealed its darkest secret. The autumn rains had come, relentless and freezing, trapping Leonor inside the office. To pass the time and keep her mind sharp, she began cleaning the thick layer of grime from the intricate oak wainscoting and the exposed brickwork behind the director's heavy mahogany desk. As she ran a damp cloth over a section of masonry near the floorboards, her knuckles rapped against the brick. The sound was wrong. Instead of the dull, solid thud of thick stone, it produced a hollow, resonant echo. Her heart skipped a beat. She tapped the adjacent bricks. Solid. She tapped the suspect section again. Hollow. A frantic, desperate energy seized her. She hurried to the old maintenance closet down the hall, battling the oppressive gloom, and returned with a heavy, rusted iron crowbar. Sitting on the floor, ignoring the dust covering her skirt, she wedged the crowbar into the decaying mortar. It was agonizing work. Her hands blistered and bled. Her shoulders burned with a fire she had never known, but the sheer force of her will drove her forward. She threw her entire weight against the iron bar. With a sickening crack, the first brick gave way, crumbling into red dust. She pulled it out, then another, and another, coughing as centuries of trapped air and masonry dust plumed into the room. Behind the false wall was a cavity, and inside it rested a heavy, black iron strongbox. It took all her remaining strength to drag it out onto the floor. The lock had rusted entirely through. With one final, violent swing of the crowbar, the clasp shattered. Leonor opened the lid. Inside, perfectly preserved in the dry, dark space, were stacks of bound leather ledgers, medical files, and bundles of legal parchment sealed with red wax. She carried the armful of documents to the desk, lighting 2 extra candles. For hours, she read, the silence of the asylum broken only by the rustle of turning pages and the howling wind outside. What she found did not induce madness. It brought a horrifying, diamond-clear lucidity. The asylum had not been closed because of lack of funds. It had been closed because it had served its purpose. The medical files were full of names she recognized. Prominent farmers from 30 years ago. Rival politicians. Men who owned the most fertile land in the valley. According to the files, signed by the former director and countersigned by a much younger Silas Thorne, who was a county clerk at the time, every single one of these men had been abruptly diagnosed with severe hysteria, paranoid delusions, or aggressive mania. They had been dragged from their homes in the dead of night and locked in these very cells. But the true horror lay in the legal deeds bound beneath the medical files. Once declared legally insane and wards of the county, these men had their estates seized by the local government. The properties were then sold for pennies to a holding company controlled entirely by Silas Thorne. Thorne had built his entire empire, his wealth, and his mayorship on the bones of sane men he had thrown into the dark to rot. Arthur had found the financial discrepancies in the county books. He had found the ghost company. That was why his heart had suddenly stopped. Leonor leaned back in the director's chair, the air in her lungs feeling thick and heavy. The man who had mocked her, who had called her a hysterical, grieving woman, was a monster who had weaponized the very concept of madness to steal the world. She looked around the dark, oppressive room. She was not in a prison. She was standing in a vault of irrefutable evidence. She was sitting on the weapon that would obliterate Silas Thorne. But Thorne was not a man who left things to chance. He knew Arthur had been digging. He knew the asylum was the origin point of his wealth. He had sent the widow there hoping she would die, but paranoia was a thief that stole the sleep of guilty men. That night, the storm broke, leaving a cold, suffocating fog surrounding the asylum. Leonor was meticulously wrapping the ledgers in oilcloth when she saw it through the cracked window glass. Lanterns. 3 distinct orbs of yellow light bobbing up the winding mountain road, cutting through the mist. Thorne's men. They had come to ensure the widow was dead, or perhaps to finally burn the old building to the ground to destroy any lingering secrets. Adrenaline, cold and sharp as cracked ice, flooded her veins. She extinguished the candles instantly. The asylum plunged back into the abyss. She grabbed the oilcloth bundle of evidence, shoved it into a canvas rucksack, and slung it across her back. Then she picked up the Winchester. She knew these corridors now. She had mapped every blind corner, every rusted door, every piece of broken glass on the floor over the last week. The men outside did not. They were stepping into her domain. The heavy iron hinges of the front doors groaned as they were forced open. Heavy boots stepped into the foyer. Leonor stood completely still in the shadows of the second-floor mezzanine, looking down into the darkness. She could hear them breathing. She could smell the cheap whiskey on them. One of the men laughed, a cruel, echoing sound. He called out, his voice mocking, asking if the crazy widow was hiding under a bed. He told her they had brought a straitjacket just for her. They began to spread out, their lantern beams sweeping over the rotting walls and overturned beds like searching yellow eyes. They were careless, loud, confident in their power over a lone woman. Leonor moved like a phantom. She slipped silently down a secondary stone staircase, bypassing the men entirely. Positioning herself at the end of the long, narrow medical ward on the ground floor, she waited until the largest of the men, Thorne's chief enforcer, stepped into the corridor, his lantern held high, casting long, monstrous shadows. She did not want to murder. She wanted justice. She wanted Thorne to face the light of a courtroom, not the dark of a grave. She raised the Winchester, settling the heavy wooden stock firmly against her shoulder. She exhaled slowly, her heartbeat steadying, and aimed not at the man, but at the heavy iron medical bell hanging from the ceiling exactly 2 feet above his head. She squeezed the trigger. The roar of the rifle in the enclosed stone corridor was apocalyptic. A blinding flash of muzzle fire illuminated the darkness for a fraction of a second, revealing Leonor's cold, unblinking face. The bullet struck the iron bell with a deafening, ringing explosion of sparks and shattered metal that rained down on the enforcer. The man screamed, dropping his lantern, which shattered and died on the wet stone. The sound of the gunshot echoed endlessly through the empty wards, multiplying until it sounded like an entire army was firing from the shadows. Panic, sudden and absolute, seized the intruders. In the pitch black, disoriented by the echoing thunder and the ringing of the shattered bell, they lost all their bravado. They fired blindly into the dark, their bullets chipping harmlessly into the thick stone walls miles away from where Leonor now stood. She worked the lever of the Winchester smoothly and fired a second round into the floorboards near the foyer, showering them with wooden splinters. That was enough. The terror of the dark, the legendary ghosts of Blackwood, and the very real, very lethal sniper in the shadows broke their nerve entirely. They scrambled over each other, cursing and screaming, fleeing out the broken front doors and vanishing into the freezing fog, leaving their horses behind in their desperation to escape the madhouse. Leonor did not waste a second. She descended to the courtyard, claimed the fastest of their abandoned horses, and rode into the night. She did not ride toward the town. The sheriff belonged to Thorne. She rode north, pushing the animal hard through the treacherous mountain passes for 3 grueling, freezing days, fueled by nothing but river water and the burning fire of the evidence strapped to her back, until she crossed the county line and reached the federal jurisdiction of the state capital. She walked into the imposing marble halls of the federal marshal's office, looking like a woman who had walked through hell. Her morning dress was torn and caked in gray dust. Her hands were blistered, and her face was pale and drawn. But when she dropped the heavy canvas sack onto the polished mahogany desk of Chief Marshal Hayes, her eyes were burning with undeniable sanity. She demanded a federal tribunal. She demanded a judge outside of Thorne's payroll. When Hayes looked at her with skeptical pity, ready to dismiss her as a traumatized vagrant, she calmly untied the sack and slid the leather-bound diary of the asylum director across his desk. She told him to read the entry from October 14th, 30 years prior, the day Silas Thorne orchestrated the theft of the valley. Hayes read it. Then he read the deeds. Then he looked up at the widow, the pity in his eyes replaced by profound, respectful awe. The trial of Mayor Silas Thorne was the most explosive legal event in the history of the state. Because Thorne was a man of immense wealth and political connections, the federal trial was held in the grand courthouse of the capital, far from his corrupted valley. The gallery was packed with journalists, politicians, and the citizens of Thornestown, who had traveled by train to witness the spectacle. Thorne sat at the defense table in a pristine charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, projecting an aura of untouchable, arrogant confidence. He believed his money and his high-priced, slick city lawyers would crush this ridiculous charade before lunch. When Leonor was called to the stand, a hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. She did not look like the broken, hysterical woman Thorne had exiled. She wore a simple, impeccably clean black dress. She stood tall, her posture rigid with dignity, and walked to the witness box with the calm, measured steps of a judge ascending to the bench. The defense attorney, a tall, imposing man with a booming voice and a condescending sneer, began his cross-examination with a brutal, calculated assault on her psychology. He paced before the jury box, his thumbs hooked into his waistcoat. He spoke to her slowly, as if she were a child. He painted a tragic picture of a frail woman, unhinged by the sudden, tragic death of her husband. He reminded the jury that she had spent weeks living completely alone in the ruins of the infamous Blackwood Asylum. He leaned over the wooden railing of the witness box, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. He asked her if it was not true that the isolation, the grief, and the terrifying atmosphere of the asylum had caused her mind to fracture. He suggested that she had concocted this elaborate, paranoid delusion of grand conspiracy simply because she could not accept the mundane reality of her husband's debts and his weak heart. He turned to the jury, throwing his hands wide, dramatically stating that it was a tragedy, but the court could not convict a respected mayor based on the ghost stories and hysterical hallucinations of a woman whose mind had been broken by a madhouse. It was the ultimate, public gaslighting. He was trying to lock her in a psychological prison right in front of the world. Leonor let the silence stretch. She looked at the attorney, then past him, locking eyes directly with Silas Thorne. The mayor offered her a microscopic, smug smile. Then Leonor spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it was so terrifyingly calm, so piercingly clear, that it cut through the heavy air of the courtroom like a scalpel. She stated that the defense was absolutely correct about one thing. Blackwood Asylum was a place designed to break the mind. It was a place of isolation, of darkness, of profound despair. She admitted that the silence of the stone halls was enough to drive anyone to the brink. But, she continued, leaning forward, her gaze sweeping the jury, grief does not destroy the mind. Sometimes, grief burns away every illusion, leaving only absolute, terrifying clarity. She turned her attention back to the defense attorney. She stated that she did not bring the court ghost stories. She brought them the meticulous, bureaucratic arithmetic of a monster. At her signal, the federal prosecutor wheeled in a heavy wooden cart stacked high with the ledgers, the medical files, and the original, wax-sealed deeds from the strongbox. Leonor began to recite, from memory, the names, the dates, and the exact acreage stolen from the men who had been falsely imprisoned. She explained the horrific mechanics of the fraud. She detailed how a healthy man would be dragged from his bed, how the corrupt physician would sign a pre-written diagnosis of violent mania, and how Thorne, acting as clerk, would immediately process the transfer of their estates to his holding company. The defense attorney objected frantically, demanding the documents be dismissed as forgeries created by a deranged mind. But Leonor had anticipated this. She calmly instructed the judge to examine the ink on the documents. She pointed out that the ink used in the ledgers from 30 years ago contained a specific iron gall composition that had eaten into the parchment, a chemical aging process impossible to forge in a matter of weeks. She then directed them to the cross-referenced financial records of the county bank, which the marshals had seized in a raid the night before. The ledgers matched perfectly. Every penny of Thorne's initial wealth was directly tied to the exact dates the sane men were locked in the dark. The arrogant sneer vanished from the defense attorney's face. He stood frozen, stripped of his rhetoric by the overwhelming, undeniable weight of physical evidence. In the gallery, the citizens of the valley, the people who had lowered their eyes when Leonor was exiled, began to murmur. The murmur grew into a shocked, angry roar as the magnitude of Thorne's betrayal washed over them. Silas Thorne's immaculate composure shattered. The predatory confidence drained from his face, leaving behind the pale, pathetic visage of a cornered rat. He tried to stand, tried to shout that it was a conspiracy, that the widow was a witch, that she had manipulated the evidence. But his voice cracked. He looked at the jury, and he saw no fear, no respect, only pure, unadulterated disgust. He looked at Leonor, sitting in the witness box, bathed in the light from the high courtroom windows. She was looking down at him not with anger, but with the cold, absolute judgment of an executioner. It took the jury less than an hour to return. Guilty on all charges of extortion, grand fraud, political corruption, and the orchestrated murder of Arthur. The judge, his face grim with fury, did not grant leniency. He sentenced Silas Thorne to spend the rest of his natural life in the newly constructed federal penitentiary, a facility of cold stone and iron bars far less forgiving than the asylum he had used to build his empire. As the federal marshals clamped heavy iron cuffs onto Thorne's wrists and dragged him, weeping and broken. From the courtroom, Leonor stood up, smoothed the skirt of her morning dress, and walked out into the bright city sunlight. The passage of time is the ultimate arbiter of truth. Months turned into a year. The massive financial settlements from the dissolution of Thorne's corrupt empire, along with the reclaimed properties, were returned to the surviving families of his victims. Leonor, as the catalyst of the town's liberation, was awarded substantial damages and the legal, unburdened deed to the land upon which the Blackwood Asylum stood. But she did not burn the horrific structure to the ground as the townsfolk expected. Instead, she used her newfound wealth to rip away the darkness. She hired armies of stonemasons and carpenters. They tore down the rusted iron bars. They smashed the narrow Gothic windows to create massive, open archways that flooded the gloomy corridors with brilliant, golden sunlight. They scrubbed the stone until it gleamed, planting vast, vibrant gardens of lavender and roses in the courtyard where the terrifying well once stood. Leonor transformed the Monument of Suffering into the Arthur Memorial Hospital and Women's Cooperative. It became a beacon of true healing for the county, a place of modern medicine and compassionate care. More importantly, the old director's office, where she had found the hidden truth, was converted into a sprawling legal library. There, Leonor established a trust and a cooperative dedicated entirely to educating and protecting vulnerable women, widows, and families, ensuring that no one in the valley would ever again be separated from their land or their liberty through the manipulation of the law. Standing on the sunlit balcony of the new hospital, looking out over the peaceful, thriving valley, Leonor understood the profound, bitter irony of her journey. Society, built by men who sought to maintain absolute control, had a very specific, very effective weapon against women who dared to be inconvenient, women who asked questions, women who refused to surrender to injustice. They labeled them hysterical. They called them mad. They tried to lock them away in the dark, hoping the isolation would make the lie become reality. They weaponized the concept of sanity to protect their own corrupt minds. But Silas Thorne made a fatal miscalculation. He believed that the dark would destroy her. He did not realize that when you strip away a woman's comfort, her home, and her community, when you force her into the abyss with nothing left to lose, you do not break her. You forge her into something unbreakable. Leonor did not go mad in the ruins of Blackwood Asylum. She found the quiet, terrifying strength that resides in the truth. And when she brought that truth into the light, it was the monsters who were finally destroyed by their own darkness. If this story of absolute resilience and righteous justice moved you, take a second right now to leave a comment with your thoughts on Leonor's incredible triumph. Do not forget to hit that like button, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you're always here when we uncover another incredible tale of those who refused to be silenced in the shadows.